In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Blessed art thou, Christ our God, who has shown forth thy fishermen as supremely wise by sending down upon them the Holy Spirit, and through them didst draw the whole world into thy net. The lover of mankind, glory be to thee. Glory to the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and to the ages of ages. Amen. Lord of mercy, Lord of mercy, Lord of mercy. Lord Jesus Christ our God, who did send forth your Holy Spirit upon your disciples, have mercy upon us, illumine our hearts and our minds, open our hearts to your truth, and guide us by your Holy Spirit in charity and in love. Through the prayers of Saint Panousieris and Saint Moses the Black and Saint John the Compassionate, have mercy upon us. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you guys again for joining. As you can see, it's a little bit different than some of our other panels or other sessions have been. Tonight we have 3 guests who we'll introduce to you in just a minute. As we're going through, we do have some set questions to ask of our panelists, but please feel free to type into the Q&A or to the chat your follow-up questions, your personal questions, either for the whole panel or for one individual, and we would like to ask your questions as we go.
Father Deacon Jonathan Reavis was ordained to the diaconate by His Grace Bishop Longan of the Serbian Orthodox Church in America in May of 2019. He and his wife, Diakonissa Christina, have one daughter, Thane, who is 3 years old. They serve at St. Mary of Egypt Orthodox Church in Kansas City, Missouri, a multiracial community located in the urban core. For the past 3 years, Father Jonathan and Christina have been stewards of the St. Moses House, a community house for men inquiring about or growing in the Orthodox faith, owned by St. Mary's. Father Jonathan holds a bachelor's degree in history and philosophy and a master's degree in social work, and is currently enrolled in the Master of Theology program with the Antiochian House of Studies. He is a social worker by trade and has a special interest in the intersection of mental health and Orthodox spirituality, working with populations impacted by generational trauma to receive healing and empowerment in and through the church. Father Jonathan has served for several years on staff at Reconciliation Services, an Orthodox-founded social service agency, and now works as the case management supervisor at Hope Faith, a faith-based homeless day center in downtown Kansas City. He serves on the national board for the Fellowship of St. Moses the Black and has been a speaker at their annual convention and a contributor to their online publications. Thank you, Father, for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, and I have the great honor to introduce Stephanie Panousieris. Stephanie is a recent law school graduate who is currently serving as a law clerk at a small Southern California law firm, which represents the wrongfully incarcerated and exonerated in habeas corpus proceedings, factual innocence claims, and civil rights litigation. During her 3 years studying at Cardozo Law in New York City, Stephanie worked at the Innocence Project, which fights to exonerate the wrongfully convicted, the Center for Appellate Litigation, which represents indigent criminal defendants on appeal and in post-conviction proceedings, and the Cardozo Civil Rights Clinic, which litigates primarily in federal court on behalf of incarcerated persons and victims of law enforcement misconduct. Prior to law school, Stephanie worked as a nonprofit consultant and grant writer, assisting small NGOs grow their business and impact. At the same time, she pursued her childhood dream of dancing professionally and was honored to perform in the very spaces once graced by those dancers and choreographers whom she most admires. Stephanie holds a Master's of Arts in Social Justice and Human Rights from Arizona State University and a Bachelor's of Arts in Sociology with a minor in American Racism from the University of Texas at Austin. During graduate school, Stephanie produced a documentary short entitled Movement as Protest, How Dance Functions as a Movement for Social Change, and has spent a good part of her career exploring the intersection of art, protest, identity, and communal reconciliation.
And I have the honor of introducing Dr. Katherine Bocanegra, who was our speaker also for the second part of this series. Dr. Katherine Bocanegra is a licensed clinical social worker and currently serves as senior advisor to the Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul on crime victim and violence prevention issues. She is also completing a postdoctoral fellowship at Loyola University of Chicago's Center for Criminal Justice Research, Policy, and Practice. Dr. Bocanegra has over 15 years of community-based mental health and violence prevention experiences and specializes in working with survivors of violent crime. She has published book chapters and articles examining the intersection of the criminal justice system with urban neighborhoods. Dr. Bocanegra has been appointed to several criminal justice commissions, including the Illinois Sentencing Policy Advisory Council, the Mayor's Public Safety Research Advisory Committee, and the Governor's Commission on Criminal Justice Sentencing and Reform. Dr. Bocanegra resides with her husband in the west suburbs of Chicago, where they are raising their 6 children.
Thank you all for being here tonight. We're so honored to have you. Andrew, I think you could get us started.
Yeah, so we gave you all a little bit of an introduction, but I want you all to be able to hear from each of these amazing people what they actually do for a living, what their daily life is like, and how they find that intersection of orthodoxy and serving the people of our country. So we could start with Deacon Jonathan.
Sure. First, I want to say it's really an honor to be on this distinguished panel. Participants I feel quite humbled and honored to be here with you guys. It's exciting, and I'm really eager to hear what you have to say and share. My work as a social worker is greatly informed by my faith and my vocation as a deacon. In ways I'm still kind of living that out and figuring that out in some ways, since I was just ordained last year. But in other ways, it's just kind of been part of my life and my faith for such a long time. I have a hard time separating the two in terms of practical works and works of mercy and solidarity with my prayer life and liturgical duties as well. I am the case management supervisor for a nonprofit, non-denominational, faith-based homeless outreach center in downtown Kansas City, Missouri. We're a small team. My case management team is 2 people, including myself. But ever since COVID has hit, there were a lot of centers that shut down in the city, and Hope Faith wound up becoming ground zero. And so we were one of the few sites that remained open and modified our services. And so we very quickly became a hub for other agencies and partnerships that we were hoping to have for a long time solidified. So very quickly, my team of 2 turned into a team of like 6 and then 10. Largely what my work on the day-to-day looks like is it's very unpredictable. Largely my work is very responsive in the sense that it'll really depend on who shows up that day. We're a day center, so we aren't a shelter in the sense that we have any beds overnight, but we wind up being a pretty crucial part of the community, especially in the cold winter days when there's not much to do. We're one of the few places that's open that people can just hang out, get some food, and then get connected with resources. So a lot of my work is oriented around kind of care coordination and a lot of brokering, to use some social work terms, connecting people with other agencies and doing a lot of referrals, and then a lot of crisis management as well for people that are experiencing various levels of crisis. That's kind of on the professional side of things. And that obviously my skills and my training bleed over into my work at St. Mary as well as a deacon. Before I was ordained, my spiritual father told me that I had a really important opportunity to be a deacon, not in the sense of an acolyte that does litanies, but more in the vein of the original diaconate in the book of Acts that was formulated to take care of the needs of those that were overlooked. So that takes shape in various forms with a lot of help and partnerships with the parish. But we have a long history of being embedded in our community and responding to the needs of our neighbors, which I can probably talk more about that as the night goes on. I hope that, is that sufficient? Should I say anything more? Maybe I said too much.
Oh, I loved it. Thank you. Stephanie, can we hear from you in your work with the Innocence Project, and now, well, I guess I'll just let you go into what you're doing now.
Thank you, Andrew. So I am what we recent law grads like to call a baby lawyer. I am not yet a barred attorney. I am a lawyer because I earned a degree in the law, but not yet an attorney. So I am working under an attorney while I study for the California bar, a solo practice. She's based in Southern California. I'm in New York City. It's interesting because COVID would have made me work from home no matter what. So I don't know that it feels any different than it did before I started working for her. My last 3 months of law school were also from this exact spot. So I've gotten used to it. But the attorney I'm currently working for was a public defender for 25 years, and she has recently transitioned into doing this civil rights litigation that often follows wrongful convictions or incidents of law enforcement brutality, whether it's corrections officers or police officers out in the field. So we are in the midst of federal civil rights litigation right now, representing a client who was wrongfully convicted based on evidence that was fabricated by a Los Angeles police department officer. And we're suing the city of Los Angeles as well as the individual officer for her unconstitutional acts. And I unfortunately can't say any more about it because we're right smack dab in the middle of the litigation. This is my first, it's not my first case I've worked on. I'm doing a lot and I'm learning a lot in a very short period of time. I've only been out of school 6 weeks, and I can't even describe to you how much I've learned in that 6 weeks. So before that, I was at the Innocence Project, like Christina and Andrew mentioned, for a year as one of my clinical internships during law school, and that was a wonderful experience. It's incredibly sad work often, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a while, but that's really where my faith comes in. It's often reflected in the people that I'm serving, because somehow through all of this horrible trauma that people have been through, they shine this light and have this joy that I can't begin to comprehend or understand, because I feel very angry about what has happened to them, and it didn't happen to me. I am actually very good friends with one of my former clients now, since I'm from the Innocence Project, who unfortunately is still incarcerated. We talk on the phone every other day. I've stayed pretty close with him, and he has been in prison since I was 3 years old. I'm 31. The last he remembers about the outside world is he gets very upset when I say rollerblading, roller skating. And we look forward to the day that we get to go roller skating together. We talk about it all the time. So that's a little bit of what I've been working on.
Thank you, Stephanie. Looking forward to hear the results of this litigation. It sounds very, very, very interesting to hear what will happen with that. So, and Dr. Kathryn, could you give us a little background into your more day-to-day work?
Sure. So I'm based in Chicago, and my background is in community mental health and community violence prevention. So what does that mean? Community mental health meant that I didn't work inside of hospitals, but I worked out of community clinics, kind of like storefront type settings. I worked out of schools. I did a lot of services out of people's homes, ranging from working with adults with severe mental illness, like psychotic disorders, all the way to kids who were getting released from detention facilities. And my community mental health work led me to do violence prevention work, because I noticed that in the neighborhoods that I was working in Chicago, which were predominantly immigrant neighborhoods, home to Mexican and Mexican American families, that the number one experience that they all shared that led to kind of the issues that they were having was exposure to violence. And so I felt increasingly kind of useless in my role as a therapist by having them come sit with me for an hour and then going back to the same community challenges. And so I wanted to have a larger role in their life and try and change the community circumstances. So that led to an opportunity to work for a nonprofit as the director of violence prevention for 6 years. And what does violence prevention mean? So I ran every kind of program under the sun, ranging from working with children who had been exposed to violence at an early age, 0 to 3, to school-based mentoring programs, peer jury, gang exiting, prisoner reentry. I ran coalitions around prevention, coalitions around street intervention. And again, all in a neighborhood that has one of the highest rates of shootings and homicides in Chicago on the southwest side. So I was in the deep end of this kind of work in an area that continues to have really persistently high levels of violence. And so those two areas of work, mental health and violence prevention, led me to be appointed to different kind of criminal justice reform spaces. And so what does criminal justice reform mean? It's trying to largely reduce the number of people, at least in Illinois, reduce the number of people we have in our jails and in our state prisons. And so it's been really powerful to be in these spaces because now I get to impact policy. So I went from, sitting with people one-on-one in their homes or in a school in my office to trying to reduce levels of violence in a neighborhood to now impacting state laws, which can reduce the number of people in prisons by hundreds or thousands within the course of a year. And that led to our current Attorney General to asking me to be his senior advisor on violence prevention and crime victim services. And because I'm not a lawyer, I literally, when he called me and asked if I would assume the position, I looked up what is an Attorney General. And Attorney General is like the lead cop of the state. It's the lead law enforcement officer, lead prosecutor. But we have a very, so ideologically, it stands kind of opposed to my practice experience. Because I usually work with people who are being convicted of crimes. But I run support groups for families of homicide victims. But he's really doing amazing work to try and expand who we recognize as a victim in our state, recognizing that predominantly Black and Brown victims have been underserved or completely barred treatment and victim services in our state, and expanding access to them. And then through trauma recovery services is really important. So that's the really fun work that I get to do. And then on top of all of that, getting to be a scholar in this space, getting to be a researcher means I get to sit and think about it, which is a luxury that most practitioners don't get. You're just going all the time, and you don't get to sit and reflect. So I feel like I have just the best of both worlds.
That's incredible. I'm amazed at the work that the three of you do, and I'm eager to hear how you can be in conversation with one another. I'd like to take a step back and just ask, how, for each of you, how did you choose to go down this path in the first place? And do you have any advice for young people who would be considering a career in your field? So whoever feels, called to go first, you can take it away.
My how I got here is way too long and will bore all of you, so I'll give you the really short version. But I have always been interested in racial justice and criminal justice reform for as long as I can remember, starting from when I was a kid, just being inquisitive about my community and who looked like me and who didn't look like me and why those things were. Why we were separated in neighborhoods or in classrooms at school or whatever it was. And as I got older and went to college, I had a unique opportunity to self-design my own minor, and I chose to title it American Racism and kind of do a little mini, very, very, very small undergraduate level research project about self-segregation on my campus and self-segregation versus segregation that may have been imposed from archaic policies when the school first created its policies of how they match people together to live in dorms. Then I went to graduate school and I focused heavily on the intersection of art and social justice work. And during that period, I actually really, like you, Deacon, I really thought I was going to get into social work. I thought that was really kind of where I was headed, or some sort of art therapy or something social worky in that field. And I spent 5 years working after I graduated from grad school, dancing and doing the nonprofit work. And while I was doing those things, I was really enjoying myself, but I wasn't feeling like I had quite found where I could best use what I saw as my talents and then also strengthen what I see as my weaknesses. And so though I was enjoying the work, I actually sustained a pretty bad injury while I was dancing and had to have surgery. And at that point I had to decide what I was gonna actually do next. And I had an opportunity to become, or at least I was in the final count of people being interviewed for, I don't know that I would have gotten it, to run a very large nonprofit dance school here in New York City that has a professional company under it. It would have been a very good job. And at the very end of the interview process, I ended up telling, she was my boss because I worked there as a dance teacher, that for some reason this process had made me realize that I thought I was on the wrong path. I was just on a path of something that I was good at and that I enjoyed, but that it didn't feel like it was supposed to be my career. I can't really tell you why I ended up at law school, other than the fact that while I was looking for jobs during this time, other than dancing and teaching, I kept coming across things. I was like, oh, I want to do that. I want to do that. And then I realized I need a JD to do that. I need a JD to do that. And so even though it had always kind of been in the back of my head, I know my mother's in here right now. My mother and father like to say they always knew I was going to be a lawyer, so I can argue about anything. And yes, and Christine is my sister, for those of you who don't know, so that's why she's making that face. So I ended up making a decision to go back to school 5 years after graduate school, and be everyone's mom in law school, the babies who had just come out of undergrad. And I haven't regretted it for a second, even in the horrible moments in law school. Everyone thinks I'm absolutely nuts because I loved law school. And so if you even have the smallest inclination to go to law school, I'm the girl to talk to, because most people will tell you not to do it. Everyone told me not to do it, and I wholeheartedly disagree. So I'm happy to pass out my email to anybody who is even considering it a little bit. It's great work. I love it. It's very fun, intellectually interesting. Highly recommend.
Thank
I can't
you.
tell you how many times, like in a week, I think, man, I need to know more lawyers. Like constantly. 'Cause
Well,
so many of my clients have serious legal issues that need help with, and I'm not a legal professional, so sometimes I'm like, man, I should have gone to law school.
never too late.
My wife would kill me.
Deacon Jonathan, will you share a little bit about how you got to where you are?
Sure. It's a very long and winding road, but I'll try to keep it real short. I wasn't raised Orthodox. I was raised Protestant, largely Baptist, non-denominational. And so a lot of my childhood actually had a big part to play in that, both in my self-understanding. My mother's Korean, my father's white, so my relationship to race was always a little confusing, and having to navigate that very early. I grew up mostly in a pretty big, wealthy megachurch in Houston, Texas. And then in middle school, my family decided to actually change churches, and started attending a mission church in the inner city of Houston. And instantly my peer group changed very rapidly. And I had to wrestle with the shift in lifestyle and my peers and the experience that my peers had, and then even wrestle with my own internalized racism that I hadn't really recognized. And as a 12-year-old, I was trying to figure out, like, why is it that I want so badly to be white right now, and why am I so uncomfortable with being mistaken for Mexican when most of my friends are Mexican. So had that kind of conversation early on, and then the sort of struggles that my peers were going through and the community that we were embedded in were going through kind of set a different trajectory for my relationship to faith. Long story short, I've always been kind of involved in church related work. After high school, I did some traveling and some serving. wandering a lot, not really thinking about career very much. And then eventually, kind of after a couple of years, decided to go to Bible school. So I went to Chicago to Moody Bible Institute for a year, and I didn't survive because at that point I had had enough significant theological shifts. I was already on my way to Orthodoxy, so I couldn't really hang. But at the time, my major was urban ministry, so I was interested in figuring out how to integrate church ministry with outreach and caring for the material needs of the community as well as the spiritual. And so I eventually dropped out and moved to Kansas City, where my wife was, at the time, girlfriend, studying art. And then eventually went back to school and finished my undergrad in philosophy and history, and then went to, during that time, I was working for Reconciliation Services, which was founded by Hiram Monk Alexi Altschul and his wife, Thelma Michaela, of blessed memory. And that was really it's a social service agency that was founded through the parish here. And by that time I had joined St. Mary's, became Orthodox, and St. Mary's really was this home of finding this integration, these deep wells of spiritual richness that had an overflow into the community. And Father Alexi's vision for community building, for village building, that was focused on addressing the deeply systemic and structural issues with prayer and compassion. And so attending St. Mary's and working closely with Father Alexi and then Father Justin, who's the executive director of Reconciliation Services, eventually led me back to deciding to get my master's degree in social work. And so that's kind of the long, winding road on that. I think it's interesting because my day-to-day practice is very, and even in the church, is very, it is micro level. It's one-on-one, it's people, and often constant banging my head up against the wall of major structural issues. So it's funny because I often think maybe it's my philosophy and history degree. I have like a macro mind with a micro heart or something. I'm not sure. So I'm often reflecting and thinking about structural issues and trying to figure out an integration of advocacy as well as personal interaction with people as well.
Thank you. Katherine, how about you?
I'm so glad that Deacon Jonathan went before, because Father Alexi Altschul is one of the priests that married me and my husband. And when my husband converted to Orthodoxy, he was like, the Orthodox don't care about poor people. And I had to drive with him from Chicago to Kansas City to be like, there's this one example in our country. And at that time, Mother Michaela was still alive. And she looked at my husband and like in 30 seconds was like, you're going to become Orthodox one day. At that point, my husband was convinced he wasn't, because the Orthodox don't care about poor people. And as you can tell, he grew up in inner city, tremendous amount of trauma in his upbringing in his life, but now he and I are involved in similar work around violence prevention. So how did I get to where I am right now? Like we talk about diaconia in the church, and like diaconia in my perspective is social work. So like Deacon Jonathan, you're like a deacon, like deacon squared. Service to others rooted in the gospel. And so, I'm cradle Orthodox, third generation Greek. My dad's a deacon in the church as well. And so my parents always just taught us to live a life with purpose. And the purpose for me had to be living out the gospel, and social work was such a natural fit for me. But whenever, people ask like, how does my faith fit into my work? I always say like, it's kind of the opposite. My work really fuels my faith. And I want to share kind of like a brief example of what, it looks like. And so For 10 years, I've been running support groups for families who've lost children to violence, which is the most horrible thing that can ever happen to a parent. And there was one mother that I worked with who, while her son's blood was still on the street, that we organized a community vigil to, allow the family to grieve, to show the family support, and also to prevent revenge, like vengeance killing. And so we were in this vigil, and this mother openly forgave the person who killed her son and begged the young men who were standing in this, in the street gathering to not hurt anybody else, because she doesn't want another mother to go through this pain. And that night, she said she went home and she prayed that, she said, God, there's this huge vacuum in my life. All this love that I had for my son is like, what do I direct that towards now? Because he's not with me. And she felt that God answered her in her heart, give it to others. And that always stood with me, because about a year ago, I was rereading the biography of Mother Maria of Paris, who also lost a daughter to sickness, her daughter Anastasia. And her way of grieving, she said, was through service to others, which she coined as universal motherhood, which was literally what I heard from this woman in the streets. And so I've always said to others, I think it's to our spiritual detriment that we are not actively concerned with and involved with in the lives of those who are suffering, and those who are at the nexus of violence, either as the victim or perpetrator, are at the intersection of every other form of societal marginalization, at least from my experience. And so now, like, specific to violence prevention and criminal justice reform, something I also share with people that kind of shocks them is when I talk about how when God took on human flesh, he became a death row prisoner, which most people kind of, oh, and that he suffered political violence, went through a hijacked trial proceeding, which I know Stephanie can speak to that, and was condemned and executed along two thieves, and that the first person admitted to the kingdom of heaven with him was a thief, a condemned criminal as well. And somehow we overlook, I think, the central act of our faith, and that we want Jesus to be remembered as a beautiful baby in Mary's arms, a miracle worker, an eloquent preacher, and the resurrected son. But he saved us by submitting himself to capital punishment as a convicted felon. And so doing this work among people who are victims and perpetrators of violence, I think is very close to Christ's experience as well.
That's beautiful. Thank you for jolting us awake with that.
Sorry.
We need to hear it more.
Sorry.
I think that's a really great way to lead into our next topic. I know all of you have touched a little bit on, where faith comes into your work. I like Deacon Squared. I'm definitely going to use that. But I would love to hear if any of you want to say any more about that, about how your Orthodox faith influences your work, or how your faith is strengthened by the work that you do, or challenged.
Yeah, I mean, I would resonate, I echo and resonate a lot with what Dr. Katherine has just said. It often does feel that way, that it's not my faith that fuels the work, but the other way around. I often think about this, and actually, I wrote a short article for the Fellowship of St. Moses after the killing of George Floyd, kind of looking at this and targeting this in particular, that we really are missing out something in our faith. The Lord, the Sermon on the Mount says, blessed are the poor. And importantly, this is something that even, St. Panousieris of the Holy Mountain mentions, that it's really the poor or the hungry that can understand spiritual nourishment. That if we're so detached from some of these things, we're missing a key piece of our faith, and who it is that Christ identifies with. As Mother Maria frequently says, that at the final judgment, I'm not going to be asked how many prostrations I did, how many services I went to, but if did I feed the hungry or clothe the naked, visit the sick or those that were in prison. And I think the further and further we get, and the more we get comfortable, and that the more that our faith acts as a sort of insulating wall from the pains and the hurts of this world, the more it becomes distorted, and the more that we actually miss Christ. And so for me, in a lot of ways, I can't even really pray apart from my work in an authentic and serious way, and in the way that the Lord has taught us to pray, as referring to God as Father. In myself and in my pride, I'm often very independent and think of myself as very self-sufficient and as strong and as capable, which is kind of all the opposite values of the Sermon on the Mount. And the work that I do is intensely spiritual, in the sense that it's a deep gift and a reminder to me of my actual humanity, the reality of my state before God, before my fellow human beings. That it's not a matter in many ways. This is something that our tradition teaches. It's not a matter of my work being something where I'm donating from my great wealth of what I have, or my wisdom, or lending my professional expertise or whatever. It's really the opposite. The kingdom of heaven is a bit of an upside down kingdom from the values of this world, where every human being that I encounter, I encounter saints every day. Like people that I work with, sometimes I cannot fathom how they have the hope that they do. I can't, like I was just speaking yesterday with a young man that was recently released from prison, and he was really struggling trying to talk about like doing the right thing and moral choices, and knowing that at the same time in this city, because he has a felony, he has such a long road ahead of him in terms of getting housing, getting employment, being stable. And he still was insistent that he wanted to make the right choices and leave a legacy for his boys. And these sorts of experiences remind me of where the kingdom of heaven is daily and where the saints are daily. That it's really a privilege, and it's the liturgy after the liturgy, as Mother Maria says.
Stephanie, do you want to add?
Sure. I couldn't agree more with Dr. Katherine and with Deacon. I think that for me, it has long been that my work helps me develop my faith. I am admittedly very bad at my faith, for lack of a better way of saying it. I have a really hard time developing a regular spiritual practice for lots of reasons, as we all struggle with sometimes. And what I have found in my younger life, but also really in my adult life, is that what I do know how to do is connect with people, and what I do know how to do is talk to people and be with them and listen. And I might not know how to pray, but I need to do the thing that I know how to do and see Christ reflected in every person that I am working with or for or on behalf of, or whether it's my colleagues or my clients. That I really, really think that the position I am in gives me the blessing and the challenge on a daily basis to challenge my own biases, to challenge my own perception of my role in my clients' lives. I am often reminded that there is only one Savior, and it is not me. And that is not my role to try to be that for everyone. It's degrading for a lot of people to be treated as if they can't be without you. And although legal services are necessary, and in a very strict sense, I may be necessary for a certain person in a certain proceeding to get done what needs to be done for them and for their liberty and for their freedom, or to vindicate their rights, but they don't need me. If anything, I need them. And I think that relationship is the closest that I've come to experiencing the face of God. And I don't want to let it go because of that, because it very much feels like the way that I know how to grow closer to Christ, and not the other way around, because I have no idea how to do it the other way around. Even with all of the wonderful people I have in my life, like my sister, have a wealth of knowledge and this deep faith, and I look at it and I'm just like, I don't know how to do that. And so my hope is that, you know, in seeing, I mentioned earlier, and I think it bears repeating, that there's also this incredible amount of hope and joy that comes from this really devastating, difficult work, because the people who are most affected on a daily basis by very intentional systems of oppression and poverty and racism somehow are still like lifted in their spirits. And of course, that's not true across the board. Plenty of people have a lot of very righteous, well-earned anger, and difficulty coping with the situations that they've been put in. But there's still, I have found in the vast majority of my clients and the people I have worked with, just this spirit of joy that I reach for. I reach for to the best of my ability, because that is how I know how to reach for Christ. And I'm going to keep doing that as long as that's the way that I find him, and let my faith grow in that way, like we said, rather than the other way around.
Dr. Kathryn, I know you kind of segued us into this question, but I wanted to be sure there wasn't anything else you wanted to add on this topic before we asked you all something else.
Yeah, no, keep going with the questions. Yeah.
Okay, Andrew.
Okay, I just want to open this up to the panel. Just feel free to answer as you feel compelled, and maybe we'll get into a decent discussion around this. But how do you think that this moment in history that we're seeing is different in the past in terms of social change around racism? And I guess following from that, how is it the same, or how are we seeing the same issues resurrect themselves over and over again and not really being solved?
At the risk of everyone being very annoyed by my voice, because I was just talking, I'll jump in. I want to start with how I think it's different. There are a lot of reasons it's different. We can get into the sociology, and Dr. Katheryn can, I'm sure, talk about a lot of what's happening in this moment that's contributing to this conversation. But to be very blunt, the difference is that white people are starting to listen and wake up. Nothing has changed for people of color. The only thing that's changed is the ability for everybody to carry one of these in their pocket and film the things that they're seeing and that are happening. Nothing is new for Black community, you know, and other minority racial communities in this country. So I think what's different is there's this acceptance, there's this opening of hearts, I think, of people who have had this very self-centered, whether intentional or not, perspective of, you know, privilege and what it means to be of a certain status in society, whether or not you have done anything to contribute to that status. You're born into it. You're born with the color of your skin, whatever it is. I think for people who are white in this country, it's very easy to say, I trust the police. The police are the good guys. I can walk up to the police and get directions and have no problem. And we're slowly coming to this realization that that is not a lot of people's experiences. I find it very exciting that something like qualified immunity is now in like the public vernacular, which I find amazing, because law students don't even know what qualified immunity is. People who have practiced law their whole lives are still confused about what qualified immunity is. But long story short, it's basically a way that officers or other state actors are shielded from liability. So say there's an excessive force case, someone is injured, qualified immunity allows the court to basically say, in simplest terms, my civil rights professor would be very upset with my definition right now, but keep it very simple, that someone can have violated your constitutional rights but be free from liability if that whatever happened wasn't clearly established, which basically ends up being, did this exact thing happen in the past and has a court already ruled on it? For example, if a police dog goes and attacks a person who is standing, that's now different than a police dog who goes and attacks someone who's sitting. And that small discrepancy allows the court to say, well, the officer couldn't have known that there was a foreseeable consequence of an unconstitutional end. So the fact that that is in this moment right now and that everybody's talking about that, I think is incredibly significant. I'm not entirely sure how that came to be, other than crediting the Black community who has led this kind of moment and uprising for many years now. Back in 2015, I remember writing an article about the Black Lives Matter movement in it, and it was pretty young. It was in its infancy still. And I look back and I read that article now, and I think about how tame it seems, that it felt very, very hard to write for a white audience and talk about this without knowing. I'm from a pretty conservative community in the South that, at the sake of, being stereotypical, has very particular views about race and class. And I read that now and I think how much we've grown as a white society in the last 5 years. And that part of it excites me, because regardless of our intentions, the fact is that white people have the power in most of these situations to be able to make systemic change. And it's exciting to me that people are waking up to the realities that others have lived with for a really long time.
I just had a question following up to the qualified immunity. So so obviously, like you're saying, that police officers experience that. What is it, just the position of being a police officer, or does it extend to other members of the government, or who does it apply to? And how did that come to be? Although that's kind of difficult to say, probably.
I can give you a brief answer. It applies to state actors, so government actors. So it can also be a public school principal, or and there's racial discrimination in the school. So these are state actors we're talking about, and it came to be, it's judge-made law, which basically means that this was never written in a statute by a legislature. This was never considered. We have a statute called Section 1983 that lets you sue state actors when they have violated your federal rights. So if the federal constitution has been violated by someone in the state, so for example, this Los Angeles police officer that I'm currently suing, she works for the state, for the county of Los Angeles, but she violated my client's constitutional rights, so I can sue her in federal court. What the judges have done in response to that, and actually that Section 1983 was originally called the Ku Klux Klan Act. It's over 100 years old, and it was specifically meant to help eradicate the violence against Black people in the South who had been freed and were being brutalized in the Jim Crow era. And it allowed the federal government to step into the Confederate states where rights were being violated and kind of have a remedy. What judges have done is basically pull that back and say, look, we can't let these officers be sued for just anything, because then officers will be scared to do their jobs. They'll be scared to shoot when they need to shoot. They'll be scared to arrest when they need to arrest. So we need to find a way to balance that interest with vindicating these rights. Unfortunately, it's just developed over time to be a huge bar to actually litigating these issues. And it very much needs to change. So call your legislature.
Thank you. Deacon Jonathan or Dr. Kathryn, would you care to add anything to that topic of, this current situation we're in and how it develops and where it's been and where it's going?
Sure. I agree with everything that Stephanie said. And something that we discussed with the 13th film is how systems reinvent themselves. And so how slavery reinvented itself through Jim Crow laws, then reinvented itself through criminal justice practice in the name of public safety. And so what I think is different now is I think structural. I mean, there were more policy changes that happened during the civil rights era that had some structural implications, but like real conversation around how can we reimagine public safety without police, and how do we reduce the criminal justice imprint on certain communities, I think is really really exciting and really frightening some people as well, to think about what safety means without police in the picture. So I think that's different right now. There were a lot of concerned white people in the civil rights movement. It was more of like a North versus South kind of dialogue and conflict, really. And if you're interested in like, well, how did white people respond in the 60s with the civil rights movement, there's a good book called Freedom Summer, which some of you might be interested in checking out. But basically, a bunch of Ivy League white students from the North got on buses and went down to Mississippi to try and register voters in counties that had, counties that were predominantly Black but had like 2 registered voters. And it talks about some scholars argue that what really brought attention to the civil rights movement was not the activism of Black communities in the South. It was the fact that white students experienced violence through their activities in the South. And the reason why some of the activists in the South allowed for students to come in and help with voter registration was because they knew it would bring national attention. But I recommend Freedom Summer as kind of a good way to think about what white concern looked like at that time. But I think that it's possible for real structural change to happen right now. It's possible, but I'm also seeing kind of the same biases kind of rear their heads right now. And hearing people talk about how, the taking down of statues, changing laws, renaming parks, etc., that have all been named in honor of people who supported some form of oppression, whether it was slavery, some racist policy, etc., that we're eroding the history or fabric of our country, our traditions. And so I don't think the battle's any easier now than it was in the 60s. It's just taking a different form. So.
Dr. Kathryn, I wanted to follow up that what you just said with kind of what the question we had come in. As Orthodox, and so for a lot of us coming into this country as people who are not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, we oftentimes struggle with our own identity in America. So to put it bluntly, are Greeks white? And I guess
I love this question. This is the best question. Thank you, Ronald Clark. I see you in chat. So thank you for asking an awesome question. Because so I'm a social scientist, so I think a lot about race and ethnicity, and I use census data. So the census is arguably the most scientific way to kind of parse this stuff out, and they've been trying to do it for 2,000 years. Remember, Jesus participated in the census, so or Mary did. Okay, so if you look up Census 2020, the category of white, I'm going to tell you how they define white. All right. All individuals who identify with one or more nationalities or ethnic groups originating in Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. Examples of these groups include, but are not limited to, German, Irish, English, Italian, Lebanese, Egyptian, Polish, French, Iranian, Slavic, Cajun, Chaldean. Greek obviously fits in there, okay? And so a lot of times we conflate race and ethnicity, and they're 2 separate things. And so we can ethnically be Greek, but racially we're white. And I've been kind of surprised because I wrote kind of an angsty Facebook post a month ago about how upset I was to see some of the victim blaming and shaming and criticism of what's happening right now. and tried to put it in some historical context. And a lot of people, and I referenced this, like if you look at the census definition of white, almost all Orthodox Christians, with the exception of our Ethiopian and Eritrean, brothers and sisters in Christ, really fall under white. And so if we can't place ourselves in terms of our racial and ethnic identities into the fabric of this country, it's really hard to talk about racial injustice, because people can't make, it's a tripping wire. And so yes, Greek people are white, Serbian people are white. And what does that mean? Is that yes, we are a minority, but we have majority privileges. And there's a lot more I could say about that, but we are a minority with majority privileges is, I think, the best kind of succinct way to explain why it's important that we recognize our racial identity at this moment.
Just something that popped into my head kind of in response to that. When I do see census documents, you're asked your race and then you're asked your ethnicity, and basically the only options are you're either Hispanic or you're not. So for someone who might come from maybe Costa Rica or Colombia or Mexico, where does that fit in the race question? I know that's not exactly what we're talking about today, but I was just curious.
They're white. Yeah. And then I use census data. So when everyone fills out these forms and it's calculated and posted online, it actually tells you who is white, who's non-Hispanic white is a category. Hispanic white is another. So they do differentiate when they report out data, but that's how they would respond.
There's a helpful book that I read in undergrad by Matthew Jacobson called Whiteness of Another Color. Some of you may have read that. It's a helpful genealogy of whiteness in this country and how we ended up on a black-white binary and the subsuming of ethnicity into whiteness, which is not unproblematic for white ethnic identities too.
Yeah, but to Deacon's point, there was a reason why they absorbed ethnicities into whiteness. Who were they trying to disadvantage through that? Black people. And that's why I've been seeing I like studying people's kind of social media reactions and limit myself to doing that once a week because I get too much acid reflux from it. But the whole point being is I see people saying, well, I'm of Irish descendancy and I want reparations now. And then they'll post a picture of Irish immigrants in cages at the turn of the century, which are horrific, gut-wrenching images. And then I see people kind of being Greek people were discriminated. I remember my grandparents being ridiculed when they immigrated from Greece, that are oh, Greek people demand reparations and stuff like that. So there is not a racial or ethnic category in this world that has not suffered some kind of devastation in terms of their cultural history. So I'm not denying that. But what I do want to say though is that the experience of African Americans is qualitatively different. And I would also say qualitatively and exponentially more horrific than the experience of majority of ethnic groups and their acculturation experience in this country.
There's a little bit of a anecdotal little fact that might help with this in our city, and not to throw anyone under the bus, God forgive me, but in our city, just down the street from where St. Mary's has been for 30 years, we just actually purchased a new temple further east in a neighborhood. But just down the street on Linwood, in what is now a warehouse for Habitat for Humanity Restart, is a Greek temple, a Greek Orthodox church. And it says it right on the front. It's kind of this painful reminder. It just says Greek Orthodox Church right there on the front. And it is this sort of painful reminder of the migration and of that that Greeks are white and that just like many white populations, where in this particular neighborhood along Troost Avenue, which was a very bustling economic center where there were a lot of black businesses and there where have been Black neighborhoods or integrated neighborhoods here for years in the 30s, 40s, 50s process of white flight, and the Greek church there was part of that. And now we're the only Orthodox church in the urban core, in the city. All the others in this city are in the suburbs, which isn't a shaming thing. It's not a condemnation, but there is the fact of the ability to have that sort of mobility and the ability to excuse oneself from the pain, the suffering, the systemic injustice, and I think the disenfranchisement as well.
Thank you. I don't want to miss out on the opportunity to ask this question tonight. I'm really hopeful that we have some students who are listening tonight or who will watch this recording who will be inspired to reach out to you, who will be inspired to do the kind of work that you're doing. But I also know there's Andrews and Christinas and Kira's out there who have other callings, but we also want to know from your perspective and from the work that you're doing, what can we do that's faithful to our Orthodox, to the Orthodox Church and to Christ, to be part of the change that needs to happen in our society. Dr. Katherine, do you want to go first?
Sure. Here. Come on, husband. He's ear hustling, so I just might as well include my husband in this since it's a family affair. Okay. So there are a few things I think are really important. The first is, I think everyone needs to recognize that racism is an evil. All right. There's no question. I think that what's happening a lot is that we're getting too into the weeds of the histories of people, and well, maybe the law enforcement officer was right in how his response was, whatever. Is that racism is alive and kicking, and racism is evil, and we as Orthodox Christians should be concerned. So if we're operating under those assumptions, then we have a responsibility to do something. And I think we have a responsibility to engage in works of justice, okay, related to this. So what do I mean by that? Is that a lot of our churches are involved in Kira heard me talk about this earlier, or over the weekend, the OCF first. No, CrossRoad students, okay. So that we like doing one-off kind of ministry charitable work, where like feeding people in soup kitchens, doing a coat drive, etc. But we never ask the question, or like, why are so many people hungry or don't have clothes to wear, or continually in disadvantaged positions? I think it's time for us as Orthodox Christians to really critically think about engaging in works of justice, which is changing the systems that maintain oppression, right? And that I think is going to be difficult for a few different reasons. Because it exposes conflict, and also because a lot of us don't know how to do it. You have somebody with a macro, the deacon with a macro mindset. We have a lawyer who thinks about systems and stuff like that. But your average churchgoer at this time is going to say, well, how to stop people from being hungry, right? But I would be very surprised if there wasn't one person in every Orthodox parish in this country that has no clue how to change systems. And something that we can do as Orthodox Christians, I think, is think about catching up on 60 years of history of racism and oppression in our country, okay, which everyone's doing right now by buying books like White Fragility, etc. So catching up on history, understanding what's happening right now, and then trying to figure out our place either through tapping into talents within our parishes, right? Or given that, with the exception of parishes like St. Mary of Egypt and Reconciliation Services that were like 60 years behind everyone, is that I think our a meaningful place where we could start also contributing, right, to the movement is through community building. And what do I mean by that? Is that really developing authentic relationships with the people in the communities surrounding our parishes, especially our urban parishes, where we usually feel threatened by the community and hire security guards that protect us from surrounding communities. Just saying, that's what I'm seeing in Chicago. And figuring out how, in the wake of some of the violence and devastation that's happened in the communities, how we provide support to residents at this time, whether it's bags of groceries, cleanup, graffiti removal, etc. Like, I think that's the entry point for us to then think about changing larger systems. So anyways, those are my initial thoughts.
Thank you. Steph, do you want to go next?
Sure. And since Dr. Katherine talked about systems and things we can do in our church communities, I think I'll talk a little bit about the internal work, which I think Deacon Jonathan is much more qualified to talk about spiritual life. But I can tell you the sort of process that I have tried to go through and continuously go through on a daily basis, sort of like developing a prayer practice, where I'm constantly challenging my own assumptions and thoughts about other people, about situations that I'm viewing or something that I'm taking in. And there are a lot of questions that I'm always posing to myself, just kind of to get a baseline of like, where am I if I'm being really honest with myself? And that, you know, starts with things like, how am I perceiving this person or this behavior right now? Do I see it as a negative or a positive? If I see this behavior in someone of a certain color, do I assume something is inherent in them because of that? And do I see it as an aberration if a white person is doing it? Or can I see that these are two people, both with good and bad struggles in their lives, one who is systemically oppressed on a daily basis and might react differently because of that? I ask myself things like, do I presume guilt? Do I presume innocence when I look at someone? When I see them on the news, when I meet my own clients, who, you know, I also do criminal defense. My clients have been convicted of really heinous crimes. They are not innocent, but they are also innocent and victims. As Dr. Katherine talked about earlier, is redefining who we see as victims and as perpetrators is incredibly important. I ask myself regularly too, like, who am I in this movement? And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about, like, it's not my job to save anyone. It's not my job to fix anyone. It's my job to be open, to listen, to absorb, and to support. And I think one of the most important things we can do in this moment right now is think about where we're putting ourselves in the conversation, and are we centering ourselves and our own experiences, or are we decentering ourselves and highlighting the experiences of the oppressed peoples in our country? And I think this extends for no matter what profession you're in. It's good to think about, not just in like when you view something on television or a show, although I think that's a really good exercise to start with. It's also looking in your own careers and in your own friend groups, and it's saying, like, who has a voice here? Who are we allowing to have a stance that we get behind? Who are we taking our direction from? And it's really important that, for me, that I'm continuously checking and making sure that I'm in that supportive role, that I am in the role as an advocate and as an ally, and I'm not overtaking it as if it is my project, because we're talking about people. We're not talking about things to be fixed, or things for me to get an accolade for doing some sort of work. So I think just constantly challenging our own biases, because we all have them. It is work to be an anti-racist. It's, you know, it's not a lot of work to just not be blatantly racist, but it is a lot of work to be an anti-racist. And just as it's really difficult to develop a spiritual life, to stay connected with Christ, to feel like you have that relationship on a regular basis, and that we struggle with it and we fall and we try again and we struggle, that is what this is. This is like our societal spiritual life of, we are Americans, we live in this country, we live in the baggage of our histories, no matter where we came from as individuals. If our families are immigrants, as Dr. Katherine said, we have the privilege that comes along with looking white, with being white. And as long as I'm constantly checking myself on all of those assumptions, I find it's an incredibly humbling experience. You realize that no matter how long you've been in the work, no matter how long you've asked and answered these questions, you still think and do the wrong things. and having some level of humility and true repentance, like really the truth of repentance, of a turning around and a changing of the mind, rather than a, I'm sorry, that's sad, which is sympathy, is not really what people want or need. What they need is support and advocacy. So I think just always asking yourself, what am I thinking right now and what is my role, can be done no matter what you choose as your profession. Who's in the boardroom, who's at the table, who's making the decisions, and how can we give up some of our privilege and power and step back and be quiet and let the people who are most affected by these things be the voices that are elevated and listened to.
Thank you. Deacon Jonathan?
Man, you guys have provided so much wisdom. I have, there's not a whole lot I can add. I think maybe on the spiritual end of things, which I don't want to create too hard of a dichotomy there. I think there's maybe there's a caution too of I think there's this tendency or this temptation to sequester religious and spiritual life from public life, from political life, from my how I understand matters of justice and my relationship to the wider society. We even have whole books written on these sorts of things in terms of a sort of escapism and a fleeing from the public sphere and a sort of retreating to try to preserve some sort of, I don't know, cultural ghetto, Christian ghetto, I don't know. And I think the caution is to say there's not really fundamentally an opposition there. There's not a conflict insofar as our primary, the primary way that we live out our life and our faith is an imitation of Christ, which St. Paul says in Philippians, that have this mind among you, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who being in the very image of God, did not consider equality with God something to be held on to, but rather made himself nothing and emptied himself. This kenosis, the emptying, the self-emptying of ourselves. And so in that sense, a sort of quietism and a political solipsism is not really a very Christian approach. That I'm just going to pray and hope that my own individual efforts in some way make a difference, or that's all I'm really prone to. It's risky, and you're going to make mistakes, and we're going to be aligned with people that feel a little uncomfortable sometimes. But ultimately, that's kind of the role of the Christian, is to lend my power or my influence in solidarity with those that are in pain. And that's going to make you a bit of a fool, maybe a fool for Christ. Mother Maria famously says that all this like instability and this lack of certainty and the sort of crumbling of our normal assumptions and institutions reminds us of our primary calling as witnesses and as fools for Christ's sake. And so I want to encourage with that resist that sort of temptation to retreat, and resist that temptation to think that my spiritual life necessarily means quietism, or that I have to get everything right in order to be involved in some way. Humility is extremely important, both for any movement that is involving oppressed peoples and for the spiritual life. Watching one's mind, one's thoughts, again, wrestling with, I think, your individual role in these things, but also not getting obsessed with your own role and trying to figure out if I can make it so that I'm clean, or that I'm guiltless, or whatever it is, that I've done everything right, or said the right things. There's a lot of learning and a lot of listening to be done. And this is importantly tied into our spiritual tradition. I can recommend, like, on a spiritual level, read the writings of Saint Silouan and Elder Sophrony. Read, even if you go to, like, our fathers, our church fathers, like Saint Maximus the Confessor, and some of these very high theoretical but deeply ascetical saints, their work only makes sense, and their writings only make sense when it's in compassion and in divesting oneself, not into nothingness. That kenotic movement is not into nothingness, but into the world, and for the life of the world, and for the love of the world, and the care of the world. And so Saint Silouan and Elder Sophrony in particular have a lot to say about allowing one's own pain to resonate with the suffering of the world, and praying from that space, and praying from the place of deep solidarity with those in pain. And we are not Christians. I mean, Elder Sophrony tempts even the idea that maybe that's the only way to be saved, because that's the only way to get into touch with Christ, is to be with those that are suffering, because that's who Christ is with, and that's who Christ is close to. So if we want to be with Christ, at least let us start with that deep compassion and deep prayer, crying out, so that our prayers even make sense. The prayers of asking for deliverance from the oppressor don't make sense if maybe we're the oppressor. So maybe we need to reassess what things that we're saying, or what position what we're in, and allow the work of the church to actually work in our lives, in our spiritual lives, and it not be siloed from this world. Don't think of your religion and your faith as an escape from this world, but as a guidepost, like a light. Like, how do I live in this world, and how am I a good steward of the things that God has given me? Sorry, that's a very long-winded thing, but that's I hope some helpful spiritual direction.
Deacon Jonathan, I think we got a question for you. Can you share some examples of successful community building, like how a parish has bridged that parish neighborhood gap, especially at a beginner's level, but also, if you want to speak specifically about St. Mary's and reconciliation services, which is definitely not the beginner level.
Well, I'll just say that we have a lot to learn. We're a young parish. There's a lot of changes that have happened in the last 20 years. So in many ways, like myself, Father Turbo, as the parish priest, has only been the parish priest for 2 years now, and he's only been in Kansas City for 5 or 6 years. A good chunk of our parish are converts. Some from the neighborhood, some from other church traditions, and a large portion of us are young. We have young families. We are blessed to have just a handful of elders, but that means we have a lot of growing and learning to do. So in many ways, we're reaping a lot of the fruit and the harvesting a lot of the labor that was put in by our predecessors, by Matushka Michaela, by Father Alexei, and by the countless others that came before us. So some of the ways of building community, relationships, very simply, getting to know people, inviting people into your homes, inviting people into your churches. There's a fine balance, and I think it requires a lot of wisdom from God, because you can sort of come off sort of, paternalistic, I guess, in some way, if you're not careful, in terms of, like, I'm going to do this outreach now, or my parish is going to do this outreach now to these poor Black people, or these poor neighborhoods, or whatever. So I think in some ways, a lot of that starts on the prayer level. Not to be too cliche, but I guess I do wear the cassock, so I have to say that sort of thing. But I do really believe that, like, our services, like Father Turbo and I, we began early Monday morning liturgies. He might have mentioned this on Tuesday, I don't know. early Monday morning liturgies a couple of years ago because of the violence that was going on in our community, specifically about asking for Mondays, the archangels, asking the intercessions of the archangels. So laying the groundwork in prayer first. That will also set the tone for your internal state. And it's also a way of at least getting your whole parish, or at least some members of your parish, on the same page. Like, if we're at least beginning to pray in this direction, that's a start. And then, yeah, getting to know your neighbors, getting to know what are the things that they need. You know, we're blessed to have at St. Mary's, we have a rolling charity fund that's sort of discretionary for me and Father Turbo and the parish council and different people in the community just to use for whatever needs that kind of come up. So not allowing that just to be our involvement with charity just to be something that we just donate to, but we have we call it the St. Nicholas Fund, that people just fill, and that gets used as we like know our neighbors, and we learn what are the needs in the community, what are ways that we can help, what are let me hear some of the stories, let me hear some of let me meet your family, can you meet my family? these sorts of things. So some of that bridging the gap involves like just being a human being, just being a good neighbor, and there are some like good, I guess, strategic or programmatic things that you could do as well. Find out and maybe start identifying like key repeated needs in your community. Like, there's a Catholic worker house that we're really good friends with here, that their whole focus is correcting and helping repair free of charge code violations for neighbors for their homes that they're getting tickets or fines, and that's one way of building trust, but also correcting or at least curbing certain inequalities where people are just going to stack up fines that they're unable to repair those things. So I think it involves a lot of listening, involves a lot of getting to know people, and digging deep in terms of making sure that we're willing to sacrifice on some way. Sometimes we approach outreach or these sort of things not in terms of thinking about sacrifice, but thinking about like what I can do and to make myself feel better. So praying around sacrifice, I think, is one way to start.
I have a follow-up question I actually want to ask Dr. Kathryn to answer, and you can also add to what Deacon Jonathan said in general. As a Greek Orthodox woman and a member now of Philoptochos for 6 years, if you could give a word to the Philoptochos community in regards to community building and its relationship to money and all the work that they do, what would that be?
Oh man. Yeah. So, well, okay. So to build off of Deacon Jonathan's response, like a really easy way to start building bridges is to just start showing up at community stuff. Like every community, doesn't matter if you're urban or suburban, has stuff happening, like a block club, you know, a health fair, whatever it is. Like, I think, unfortunately, a lot of times the only ways our parishes engage communities is through our ethnic festivals, where we're like, everyone come over to my house, but I'm not coming over to your house, kind of. You know, that's the impression. Like, what if we just showed up at a block party? Like, it's just being present, you know. And in you know, in the communities that I've worked most in Chicago, there are abandoned Orthodox churches that have become skate parks or Buddhist meditation centers, etc. And I've seen other denominations move into the neighborhood. And what do? They just start getting involved in coalitions, attending community meetings, and learning the needs. So like, we're vacating areas of need, and I see other people moving in to fill what we could be doing. So it's so simple. Just like start showing up at community stuff and like being yourself. But okay, so related to Philoptochos, I think, okay, not everybody has to be a frontline worker. Okay, so I've been a frontline worker my entire life, and even being in, you know, a position of like state government right now, like still every other Friday I pick up mothers who've lost children to violence, and we sit and we talk about issues together and help each other through it. So that's my inclination, and I understand that not everybody has that inclination or desire or feels, if you're a natural introvert. And so philanthropy is really important. Like, I can't do what I do unless somebody's helping support it. And so I would say like a younger, slightly like more radical version of myself would have said like Philoptochos is lame. But I think they play a really important role in generating the support necessary for addressing people's needs. And I'm so appreciative of it. I think if Philoptochos wanted to think critically at this time about what they do, definitely like raising funds is so important. And if I could make a recommendation to change the way the events are structured, and I'm sure this would be met with a lot of criticism, but so much of it is like entertaining ourselves while feeling good about giving money to a cause, versus just like, if we're raising money for a women's shelter for women who are fleeing domestic violence situations, like, why don't we give the money, and instead of having a tea party while we're giving the money, like, go and meet the women, or like, let's go see this shelter and see what they're going through, and think about what it's like to not feel safe in your own home where the threat of violence is ever present, and what these women go through, right? So to make it more relational, just to build off of what the deacon was saying, in addition to raising funds, because philanthropy is so, so important, and that I think people would feel as good like having tea as they would seeing the physical structure or seeing the faces of people they're impacting. And that could be, I think, even more transformational.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And encourage any young women who are on this call to consider being part of Philoptochos. Are there any other questions from attendees?
I have one more very simple suggestion that everyone, no matter who you are, can do, no matter what's going on in your life or where you live or what neighborhood you're in. There's this really great thing happening right now where people are compiling lists of Black-owned businesses in their communities so that we can make an economic difference to communities who historically have not been able to build wealth because of systemic oppression, and making really conscious choices to say, like, if I need something and that there's this community local business that's Black owned, and I can go shift how I spend my money to help make our own kind of community reparations. I think that's something anybody can do, and it's something that I've been trying to look into lately. Well, of course, once we're all allowed to go back outside and shop again, I highly recommend that.
Thank you, guys. Any last thoughts from any of the panelists? Anything that's just on your heart burning that you want to make sure those who are listening now and the students who will listen later hear from any of you?
I think one thing that I am quick to share with anybody that, and you can share any of my information too with any of the students that are interested. One of the things that I'm quick to share with anybody that asks me about getting into social work, primarily if they're interested in trying to do something good or make a difference, and not to be too pessimistic, because I'm certainly not as pessimistic as some. I do believe change is possible and systemic change is possible, especially if you're going to get into work on a ground level in a direct services capacity. There's a lot of frustration, and you're going to feel like you're not making a lot of difference. And so when you get, and you're going to be faced with a lot of broken systems and a lot of pain. So primarily, if you want to get into social work, be prepared for your primary job to be one of co-suffering and one of compassion. If you focus a little too much on like changing people, when it's really like the systems that need changing, you're going to wind up adopting very paternalistic and harmful habits, and you're going to burn out very quickly. This is why social work is often a revolving door, largely also because it's under-resourced. But your primary job is largely one of co-suffering and witnessing and validating people's pain and being present, maybe the only person present in someone's pain, and being the eyes of Christ on a Christian level. Sometimes the only thing I can do when there's nothing left, there's no resources left, and there's nowhere to turn, is at least be the eyes of Christ and bear witness to someone's pain and tell God, look, and not in a lofty way, because Christ is there, is present, and not in some sort of condemning way as if I was going to manipulate God or something stupid like that. But the work is also work that a lot of us have to do as Christians, and we're all familiar with this work, being with those that are in pain and validating that suffering and bearing witness and witnessing things that are overlooked, and then allowing that to propel into other work, to lend voices or lend space to those that don't have space or don't have voice.
Yeah, I just want to affirm everything that Deacon Jonathan said, that it is definitely a career of co-suffering, but is completely transformational. And I'm just related to this in some of the group chat that I'm seeing around like safety concerns and building relationships with neighbors, is that, so I study crime, I study violence, and I work for law enforcement. And I can tell you that someone is much more likely to hurt somebody they don't know or damage their property than somebody who they do know. Okay, proximity and relationship is a protective factor, a buffer. And so if you're concerned about participating in protests, if you're concerned about building relationships in a community where the church has experienced some level of vandalism, right? Like all of these things are indicators to me that we haven't done our best effort to build relationships with the people around us. And I'll give you one example that literally happened with one of my friends a week ago. She lives in North Lawndale. It's one of the neighborhoods in Chicago that's highest rates of violence, shootings, homicides, etc. She's a teacher there, and when she was this happened a year ago. Sorry, not a week ago. She has relationships with students in the neighborhood that she worked in, and when she left school, her car was shot up, and she was driving, and thankfully, like, she was not harmed, but her car was destroyed. Because of the relationships in her community, that night she got a knock at the door from two of her former students, somebody who she hadn't seen for 3 years, saying, "We know who shot the car. They want to apologize to you. Would you accept the apology and then allow them to do some kind of service work or whatever it may be, so that you can repair the car?" And she's like, "Of course." So, I mean, this is this drastic event of shooting, right? And that through relationships, the person who was involved was identified, and that they were brought into like a restorative or reconciliation type of encounter. And that's power. That's what we have the power to be a part of in our in the neighborhoods that we worship in, or neighborhoods that we formerly worshiped in and left. And there's so much potential. And so I just hope that everyone would consider the power of relationship and praying, just like the deacon said, as we move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Katherine. And I just want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists and to all of our attendees who have joined us in our, in some ways, you put your name down, so you're committing yourself to, trying to make a difference in your parish communities and in your church communities around your church. So thank you to Deacon Jonathan, Dr. Katherine, Stephanie, Father Paul, Father Turbo, and CrossRoad, and Fellowship of St. Moses the Black, for all of you making this possible. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And Deacon Jonathan, if you could close us in prayer.
Of course. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Christ our God, we did commission your disciples to go into the world and make disciples of all nations. Encourage us and send us out. Instill in us an outward focus, one that sees you in this world, looks for you, and greets you with love and reverence. And guide us, guide our communities, guide our hierarchs, and guide our officials, that we may more accurately and more faithfully bear witness to your kingdom. Through the prayers of our Holy Father, of Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you.